It all started like any other quiet morning in our neighborhood. I was enjoying my coffee, looking out at my yard, when I noticed something strange happening near the edge of my property. There were trucks, big construction trucks, and men with hard hats unloading equipment. At first, I thought maybe they were fixing the road or something simple like that. But as I watched closer, my heart sank. They were starting to dig right where my private tunnel runs underneath. A private tunnel? Yes, you heard that right. Years ago, I had this old underground passage built that connects parts of my property. It wasn't just some fancy decoration. It was something personal, a quiet escape, a secret path that gave me privacy and a sense of peace. I never imagined it would become the center of a neighborhood battle. But here we were, watching as my hidden sanctuary was about to be torn apart. I rushed outside to find out what was going on. Naturally, I went straight to the construction foreman and asked what they were doing. The answer wasn't what I wanted to hear. The HOA, the homeowners association that controls so much around here, had approved a new road. They said it was to improve access and help traffic flow better through the community. But the problem was, this road was planned right over my tunnel. No warning, no permission, just a full-speed plan to bulldoze through something that belonged to me. I tried to explain. I told them about the tunnel, about how it's on my property, and why it matters. But the foreman just shrugged and said he was following orders. I asked if there was a way to change the route, but he said the HOA had the final say, and construction was starting now. I felt frozen. How could they do this? It felt like an invasion, like my own home was being violated. And worse, the people responsible didn't seem to care at all. I wasn't some troublemaker. I just wanted my space respected. But in the world of HOA rules and regulations, it seemed like my voice didn't count. That's when the nightmare began. Every day, I watched as the machines tore into the earth, digging deeper and deeper through my tunnel's path. Dust filled the air, loud noises shattered the usual quiet, and with every shovel of dirt moved, my frustration grew. The HOA didn't even try to hide it. They acted like the tunnel wasn't there, like it didn't matter. I went to the HOA board meetings. I sent emails. I even hired a lawyer to send formal letters demanding they stop. But none of it worked. The board just brushed me off. They said the tunnel wasn't an official structure. They claimed it didn't affect the new road. They talked in circles, using confusing legal jargon that didn't mean much to me, but made it clear they weren't going to back down. Neighbors who once smiled and waved started avoiding me. Some even sided with the HOA, saying the road would be better for the community. It was like I was the bad guy in a story I didn't want to be a part of. Alone and frustrated, I kept wondering how this had gotten so out of control. One afternoon, I stood by the edge of the tunnel entrance, watching the workers descend into the dark passage. The sight made my stomach churn. They were destroying my privacy, breaking the trust that had existed between me and this neighborhood. I wanted to shout to stop them, but I knew it wouldn't help. They had the power, the permits, and the backing. As I stood there helpless, a thought began to form in my mind. If the HOA was going to invade my tunnel, maybe it was time I fought back. Not with lawsuits or complaints, because those weren't working, but with something unexpected, something that would make them think twice before crossing me again. I started planning quietly, watching their work schedule, learning the tunnel's layout from top to bottom. I thought about what they hadn't considered. The tunnel was mine, and I still had control over it. If they wanted to treat it like a public path, I could remind them who really owned it. It wasn't about revenge. At least, not just that. It was about respect, about standing up when no one else would. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze my world without a fight. So I waited, watched, and prepared for the moment when they would be inside the tunnel, working without realizing what was coming next. Because sometimes the best defense isn't a battle fought out loud. It's a quiet, clever move that changes everything. And that move was coming soon. Until then, all I could do was hold my breath and hope my plan would work before it was too late. Every day, the noise from the construction grew louder. The hum of machinery mixed with the pounding of hammers, and the scraping of shovels filled the air around my home. I could hear them moving closer to my tunnel. The very idea that they were inside, cutting through a passage that was supposed to be mine alone, made my blood boil. But I kept my cool. Anger wouldn't help me. I needed patience and precision. I spent hours watching the crews, noting their schedules, their breaks, and the times when fewer workers were around. I walked the perimeter of my property, checking every angle, trying to figure out the best moment to act. The tunnel itself was dark and narrow, but it was sturdy, built to last. I knew that if I timed it right, I could use that to my advantage. I had one advantage they didn't expect: water. The tunnel was below ground level, and I had a way to bring water into it. From an old irrigation system I had installed years ago, long before any of this conflict began. I had never really used it, but now it was the perfect tool. I worked quietly over several days, connecting hoses and checking valves, making sure everything was ready. It was tricky because the last thing I wanted was to cause permanent damage. I wasn't trying to destroy the tunnel, just make a point. I wanted the HOA to understand that my property was not theirs to take or misuse. Each night, after the workers left, I'd crawl into the tunnel to inspect the setup. I could feel the cool, damp air around me as I adjusted the pipes. It was eerie being down there in the dark, but I reminded myself this was necessary. This was my fight. One evening, just before the crews arrived the next morning, I double-checked everything. The hoses were connected. The valves were ready to open. I had planned it so that once the workers were inside the tunnel, I could start the flow of water remotely. No risk of getting caught in the act. When the sun rose, the workers showed up early, their boots crunching on the gravel as they carried tools and equipment. I watched from a distance, heart pounding. They disappeared down into the tunnel entrance, just like I expected. I waited. Minutes felt like hours. Then, the moment was right. I turned the valve, and water began pouring into the tunnel. At first, it was a slow drip, then a steady stream. Soon, the narrow passage began filling with water, rising quickly. Inside the tunnel, I could imagine the chaos unfolding. The workers' shouts, the sudden panic as their boots got wet and tools started slipping. The noise of them scrambling to get out must have been loud. I smiled, knowing I had the upper hand now. Outside, I saw them rush back up, dripping and frustrated, cursing under their breath. They weren't expecting this. The HOA board members, who had been watching nearby, looked shocked and angry, but there was nothing they could do. The water stopped the work cold. For the first time in weeks, the noise stopped. The machines fell silent. The road construction was paused, and the crew packed up early that day. It was clear the HOA hadn't anticipated this kind of pushback. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows began talking. Some came over to ask what had happened. I explained briefly, careful not to say too much, but I could tell many were quietly cheering my move. It wasn't just about the tunnel anymore. It was about standing up to unfair treatment. Word started to spread fast. The HOA board tried to spin the story, blaming unexpected flooding and claiming the tunnel was unsafe. But no one bought it. Everyone could see that the flooding wasn't an accident. It was a message. The following days were tense. The HOA sent letters threatening fines and legal action. They demanded I fix the damage and warned me about tamper with community property. But I knew this was just talk. They had pushed me too far, and now I had the power. I wasn't alone anymore. More neighbors began speaking out, sharing their own frustrations about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. A quiet rebellion was growing, and my flooded tunnel had become a symbol of resistance. The HOA's confidence was shaken. They had underestimated one person's willingness to fight back, and they had no idea what might come next. Meanwhile, I continued to monitor the tunnel. I made sure the flooding didn't cause real damage. This was about sending a clear message. My property was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone walk all over it. Every day, I checked for signs that construction might restart. But with the tunnel flooded and the neighborhood rallying behind me, the HOA seemed hesitant. Their power was slipping. This fight wasn't just about a road or a tunnel anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and standing up when others stay silent. And as long as the water remained in that tunnel, the message was clear. I wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the neighborhood was thick after the flooding incident. Word spread fast. And suddenly, people who had been quiet before were starting to speak up. I noticed neighbors stopping by more often, some just to chat, others bringing small gifts or words of encouragement. It was strange how one bold move could change the whole atmosphere. What felt like a lonely battle turned into something bigger, a community quietly rallying behind one person standing up to unfair rules. The HOA board didn't take it lightly. They sent letters, threatening legal action, fines, and even claims of property damage. Their tone was harsh, tried to make me feel like the troublemaker. But honestly, the more they pushed, the more people started to see what was really going on. It wasn't just about a road or a tunnel anymore. It was about control, about who gets to decide what happens in our own backyards. I started attending more community meetings. At first, it was just me, but slowly, other residents joined in. They shared their own stories, complaints about unnecessary fines, strict rules, and how the HOA seemed more interested in power than helping the neighborhood. It became clear that the flooding wasn't an isolated incident. It was the spark that lit a much bigger fire. One meeting stands out. The room was packed, the air buzzing with frustration and hope. The HOA president tried to maintain her usual calm, but even she couldn't hide the tension. People asked questions, demanded answers, and challenged decisions openly for the first time. I saw a shift happening right there, a community refusing to be silenced. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on the tunnel. The flooding had slowed down construction, but I knew the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. They were planning their next move, trying to find ways around the problem. That's when I realized this fight wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about standing firm, about making sure no one could take what's yours without a fight. The neighbors started organizing, too. From group chats to block parties, the sense of togetherness grew. People who barely said hello before were now sharing advice and strategies. Some helped document every interaction with the HOA. Others offered legal resources. It felt like a real community again, not just a collection of houses, but people looking out for one another. Every day brought new challenges. The HOA tried sending inspectors, accusing me of code violations unrelated to the tunnel. They tried to cut off access to common areas I'd always had the right to use. It was clear they wanted to wear me down, but the more they tried, the more united we became. Friends and neighbors encouraged me not to back down. They reminded me that this wasn't just about me, but about standing up for fairness and respect. I wasn't just fighting for my tunnel anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner who felt powerless against the system. One afternoon, while checking the tunnel again, I caught a glimpse of the construction crew inspecting the flooded area. They looked frustrated, trying to figure out how to proceed. I felt a mix of satisfaction and caution. This battle wasn't over, but I had made a point that couldn't be ignored. At night, I often thought about what had started all this, how a private tunnel, something meant for peace and privacy, had turned into the battleground for a neighborhood's fight for justice. I realized that sometimes it's not about the size of the problem, but the courage to stand up that makes all the difference. The whole experience changed me. I learned the power of resilience and the importance of community. I understood that sometimes when rules are misused, it takes a little creativity and boldness to set things right. And as the weeks passed, I kept waiting, watching, ready for whatever the HOA would try next. Because in this fight, I wasn't just defending a tunnel. I was defending my home, my rights, and my neighbors. The tension didn't fade after the flooding incident. It only grew stronger. The HOA wasn't about to let one person's bold move derail their plan so easily. I knew they were plotting, looking for any way to regain control and continue building that road through my tunnel. But I wasn't backing down either. Every day became a careful balance of watching, waiting, and preparing for whatever they might throw next. One morning, I noticed something odd. A group of surveyors appeared near my property line. They were measuring, marking spots, and talking quietly among themselves. It was clear the HOA was trying to find a loophole, some technical way to say, this road isn't really crossing your tunnel. Maybe they hoped to divide the community's attention or find legal wiggle room to keep digging. I walked over calmly and asked what they were doing. They said they were just updating the community maps. But their presence felt more like a warning than a simple task. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't over, and the HOA still had resources and influence. Despite the stress, I found unexpected support from my neighbors. More and more people started coming forward with their own frustrations about the HOA. Stories of unfair fines, strict rules, and the board's heavy-handed ways filled the conversations. It was like a dam breaking. Everyone who'd been holding back was now speaking out. People who had seemed indifferent before were now on my side, sharing ideas, helping spread the word, and encouraging me to keep fighting. One evening, a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door. She brought homemade cookies and a folder full of documents, letters she had written to the HOA, pictures of construction damage, and even a petition signed by dozens of residents demanding the board reconsider the road project. It was overwhelming, but also heartening. I realized this wasn't just my battle anymore. It was ours. The HOA, feeling the pressure, tried a different tactic: intimidation. They sent letters threatening legal action if I didn't remove the flooding and cease interference with community projects. I read the letters carefully, then showed them to my lawyer. It was clear the HOA was trying to scare me, hoping I'd give up, but I didn't. If anything, their threats made me more determined. I was standing up for something bigger than just my property. It was about fairness and respect for every homeowner's rights. In the weeks that followed, I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every letter, every visit from HOA officials. I knew this fight could end up in court, and I wanted to be ready. More importantly, I wanted to protect my neighbors who were starting to question the board's decisions. Transparency was key. I also began researching local laws and regulations. I discovered that the HOA had overstepped in several areas. Their plan to build a road through a private tunnel without proper permissions wasn't just rude, it was illegal. This information gave me hope and ammunition to challenge them more effectively. Meanwhile, the tunnel remained flooded. I made sure the water didn't cause lasting damage, but I refused to drain it until the HOA backed off. The flooded tunnel became a symbol, not just of my fight, but of the community's resistance. One afternoon, during a neighborhood gathering, a few board members tried to convince residents that the road was necessary for safety and property value. But the crowd was skeptical. Many stood up and shared their concerns openly. It was clear the board's usual control was slipping. I felt a shift in the air. People were no longer afraid to question authority or demand answers. The spirit of community was rekindled, and it felt like a fresh start. Throughout this, I kept thinking about what this all meant. How a private tunnel, something so personal, had sparked a movement that brought neighbors together. It showed me how important it is to stand firm, even when the odds seem stacked against you. As the HOA's plan stalled and the board faced increasing opposition, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time, I felt hopeful that respect for property and individual rights could win over heavy-handed control. I wasn't just protecting a tunnel anymore. I was part of something bigger, a community reclaiming its voice and refusing to be silenced. And with every new day, I stayed ready, watching, waiting, and standing strong, because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a hammer or a bulldozer. It's courage, persistence, and a refusal to back down. The days that followed felt like living in a constant state of alert. I kept a close watch on every move the HOA made, knowing they wouldn't stop just because their road project hit a roadblock. There was a quiet tension in the air, like waiting for the next storm to hit. But this time, I was ready. One morning, I noticed a strange delivery. A large, heavy-duty pump showed up on their trucks, along with several workers who looked prepared for serious work. It was clear the HOA had brought in equipment to drain the flooded tunnel and get their project moving again. They weren't giving up, far from it. That day, I spent hours monitoring the entrance of the tunnel, watching as they set up the pump. They worked efficiently, connecting hoses and preparing to drain the water. I felt a surge of frustration. This was exactly what I had been trying to prevent, but I wasn't going to let them just take over. I reached out to a local journalist who had covered neighborhood disputes before. I wanted the world to know what was happening, how an HOA was bulldozing a private tunnel without respect, and how a community was standing up for its rights. The journalist seemed interested, promising to come by and see the situation for herself. Meanwhile, neighbors who had grown tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics began gathering again. We talked about what the next steps could be, how to keep pressure on the board, and how to protect our homes. It was clear that the battle was about more than just a road or a tunnel. It was about holding those in power accountable. When the journalist arrived, she interviewed me and several neighbors. Her questions were sharp and to the point. She wanted to know how this whole situation began, what it meant for the community, and what the HOA's response had been. We told her everything, from the initial construction to the flooding to the ongoing threats and intimidation. The story quickly gained traction online. Social media lit up with support from people who had never even heard of our neighborhood before. Messages poured in from across the country, some offering legal advice, others sharing similar experiences with their own HOAs. Suddenly, our small fight felt like part of a much bigger conversation about fairness, property rights, and the power of community. Back on the ground, the HOA's attempt to drain the tunnel hit a snag. The pump they brought wasn't powerful enough to handle the flooding fully. The water levels dropped, but the tunnel wasn't dry yet. It was almost like the tunnel itself was fighting back, holding its ground just as we were. That gave us more time. Time to organize, to keep neighbors informed, and to plan the next move. At one of the community meetings, I shared the news about the journalist's story. The energy in the room shifted. People felt seen and heard for the first time in a long while. It was as if the outside world had suddenly turned a spotlight on our little neighborhood struggle. The HOA board tried to respond quickly with more letters and threats, but their usual tactics were losing power. The growing support for our side made it harder for them to ignore or bully us. During this time, I kept checking on the tunnel, making sure the flooding didn't cause any lasting damage. I hired a professional to inspect it, confirming that the structure was still solid and safe. That was important. I wanted to show that my actions weren't reckless or destructive, just necessary. As weeks passed, more neighbors joined the cause. People who had been silent or indifferent before now saw what was happening and wanted to help. Some volunteered to document everything. Others spread the word to local officials and community groups. One evening, I found myself sitting near the tunnel entrance, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight had tested my patience and resilience, but it also brought unexpected friendships and a sense of purpose. I realized how easy it is to take privacy and property for granted until someone tries to take them away. The tunnel, once a quiet refuge, had become a symbol of resistance and community strength. It was proof that one person's courage could inspire many. And even though the battle with the HOA wasn't over, I felt ready for whatever came next, because this was no longer just about me. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter the obstacles. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the flooded tunnel entrance, I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the fight for home is a fight that changes everything. The situation was far from settled, but something had definitely shifted. The flood in my tunnel had stalled the HOA's road project, but it also sparked a bigger fire. Neighbors who once stayed quiet were now actively involved, questioning the board's every move. It felt like the whole neighborhood had suddenly woken up from a long sleep, and they were ready to fight for their rights. I could sense it every time someone stopped me to share their own frustrations or offer support. One day, a surprising visitor showed up at my door, a local city council member who had heard about the dispute. She wanted to see the tunnel for herself and understand the story from my perspective. It was the first time official attention came to our fight, and it felt like a small victory. We walked to the flooded entrance together, talking about the HOA's actions and the impact on the community. She took notes and promised to look into the matter. Word spread quickly about the council member's visit. Suddenly, the HOA board was under more scrutiny. Their usual tactics, threats, fines, and ignoring residents, were less effective when eyes from outside the community were watching. This gave many neighbors renewed confidence to speak up at meetings, challenge questionable decisions, and demand transparency. During one heated HOA meeting, tempers flared as residents questioned the legitimacy of the road project. The board struggled to justify why they ignored private property boundaries and went ahead with construction without proper approvals. Their explanations felt weak and unconvincing, making the room fill with murmurs of disbelief and anger. I sat quietly but felt a surge of pride knowing the flood had exposed cracks in their control. Meanwhile, the flooded tunnel remained a constant reminder of the ongoing battle. The water inside hadn't caused serious damage, but it blocked the path and stopped construction crews from continuing their work. I made sure to maintain it carefully, preventing mold or erosion, because I wasn't interested in destroying my own property, just protecting it. At the same time, legal battles started to take shape. The HOA threatened lawsuits, but I had prepared well. My lawyer pointed out the HOA's violations, building without permits, trespassing on private property, and ignoring community rules. We filed formal complaints with city officials and planning departments, pushing for inspections and enforcement actions. It was exhausting but necessary. Neighbors rallied behind me, sharing photos, videos, and documents that showed the HOA's disregard for rules and residents' rights. The pressure mounted, and the HOA found itself fighting on multiple fronts, legal, political, and social. Their grip on the neighborhood was loosening. One afternoon, a group of residents and I organized a community event to raise awareness. We invited local media, city officials, and even experts in property law. The turnout was larger than expected, and the atmosphere was electric. People who had felt powerless before now felt empowered, united by a common cause. During the event, I shared my story, not just about the flooding or the tunnel, but about what it meant to stand up when no one else would. Others spoke about their own struggles with the HOA's overreach, turning the event into a collective call for change. The media coverage helped bring national attention to our fight, and suddenly, we weren't just a small neighborhood anymore. We were part of a larger movement against unfair HOA practices. Behind the scenes, the HOA board tried to regroup. They proposed compromises, like rerouting the road or improving community communication. But trust had been broken. Many residents demanded more than empty promises. They wanted accountability and respect. At home, I continued to care for the tunnel, checking the water levels and ensuring the structure stayed sound. It had become a symbol, a reminder of what can happen when people refuse to be silenced. Every time I stepped near the entrance, I felt a mix of determination and hope. This was more than just a fight about land. It was about standing up for dignity and fairness. Late at night, I often thought about the long road ahead. The HOA wasn't going to back down easily, but neither would we. The community had found its voice, and that voice was growing louder every day. This fight had tested me in ways I never expected. It challenged my patience, my resolve, and even my faith in local leadership. But it also taught me the power of unity and courage. I saw neighbors come together, strangers become allies, and a community rediscover its strength. The flooded tunnel was no longer just a barrier to construction. It was a beacon of resistance. And as I prepared for whatever came next, I knew one thing was clear. When people stand together, even the strongest walls can be broken down. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was electric, charged with the kind of energy that only comes when people start believing that change is possible. After months of battling the HOA and watching their plans crumble under pressure, it felt like we were no longer just on the defensive. We were gaining ground. But even with that momentum, I knew the fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to just fold quietly. They had resources and were experts at playing hardball. One afternoon, as I checked the tunnel again, I spotted a new sign posted at the entrance. It was a warning. Something about trespassing and potential legal consequences if anyone interfered with the property or construction. Typical intimidation tactics. But this time, instead of feeling threatened, I felt a strange sense of calm. The sign was just another reminder that they were afraid of losing control, and that meant we were doing something right. Meanwhile, community meetings became more frequent and more intense. The board tried to push through new regulations that would tighten their grip on the neighborhood, but the residents were ready. Armed with information, support from local officials, and a growing sense of unity, we challenged every proposal. It wasn't easy. Arguments ran late into the night, voices raised and emotions raw. But this was democracy in action, neighbors standing up and demanding their voices be heard. One particularly memorable meeting turned into a showdown. The HOA president tried to paint the project as for the good community, but her words rang hollow. The evidence was clear. They had ignored property rights, bulldozed over objections, and pushed to the road without proper approvals. Several residents, including myself, confronted her with documented proof and legal opinions that highlighted the board's overreach. The room grew tense as she struggled to respond. After that meeting, the momentum shifted even more. People who had been hesitant before began speaking up openly. There was no longer any hiding behind polite smiles or silence. The fight for the tunnel and against the unauthorized road had turned into a movement for fairness and respect across the entire community. But the HOA didn't give up. They started to use other tactics, sending inspectors to check for code violations on my property, pressuring other neighbors to withdraw support, and even trying to spread rumors to damage reputations. It was exhausting. I felt the weight of the battle on my shoulders every day. To stay strong, I leaned on the support system that had grown around me. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers from other communities who had faced similar battles shared advice and encouragement. I learned about legal strategies, community organizing, and the importance of keeping thorough records. Every piece of knowledge became a tool in this ongoing war. Then, unexpectedly, a breakthrough came. The city planning department announced they would conduct a formal review of the road construction project. They were responding to complaints, petitions, and mounting evidence that the HOA had acted improperly. This was a turning point. For the first time, an official body was scrutinizing the board's actions and could potentially put a stop to the project altogether. The news spread quickly. People were energized and hopeful. We prepared for hearings, gathered even more evidence, and planned to show up in force. It was no longer just about one person's private tunnel. It was about standing up to an organization that had lost sight of its purpose. Despite the pressure, I still kept an eye on the tunnel. The water had settled but never fully drained, a quiet reminder of how we had stalled the construction. I made sure the entrance stayed clear and safe, inviting neighbors to walk through and see for themselves. It became a symbol, a place where the community's courage was on full display. Every now and then, I thought back to the day the flooding started, when frustration turned into action. It was hard to believe how much had changed since then. What had begun as a personal stand had grown into a shared fight for justice. The battle wasn't over, and I knew that more challenges were ahead. But I also knew that this neighborhood had changed forever. People had found their voices, learned the power of unity, and refused to be silenced. As the city review approached, everyone felt the weight of what was at stake. But there was also excitement. The feeling that, no matter the outcome, standing together had already made us stronger. And through it all, I kept thinking, sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning quickly, but from refusing to back down, no matter how long the fight lasts. The day of the city review finally arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with a mix of nerves and determination. For months, we had prepared, gathering evidence, rallying support, and sharing our story with anyone who would listen. Now, it was time to bring everything to a public forum where real change could happen. The community center was packed with residents, city officials, and even a few media representatives. The atmosphere was electric, tense but hopeful. As the meeting began, the HOA board tried to present their case once again, insisting that the road was essential for safety and future development. But this time, their words were met with skepticism. People asked tough questions about permits, property boundaries, and environmental impact. One after another, neighbors shared their stories, their frustrations, and the damage the unauthorized road had already caused. I listened closely as voices rose with passion, each statement adding weight to the growing opposition. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly but firmly. I explained how the tunnel wasn't just a structure beneath my property. It was a lifeline, a private space that had been violated without permission. I detailed how the flooding was not an act of destruction, but a necessary stand to protect my rights and those of my neighbors. I laid out the timeline, the ignored complaints, and the HOA's refusal to follow legal procedures. My words echoed the sentiment of everyone in the room. This was about respect, fairness, and the rule of law. The city officials asked questions, probing for details and clarifications. It was clear they were taking the matter seriously. I could see them exchanging notes, listening carefully to the community's concerns. The HOA board members, in contrast, grew defensive, their confident facade cracking under the pressure. Throughout the meeting, I noticed something powerful happening. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of individuals anymore. It had become a united force. Strangers who once barely spoke now stood side by side. Voices joined in a common purpose. The energy was contagious, spreading hope and courage through the room. After hours of testimony, the city officials announced that they would halt the road project immediately pending a full investigation. The decision was met with applause and relief. For many of us, it felt like the first real victory in a long and difficult fight. But even with this win, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The investigation could take months, and the HOA might try to find other ways to push through their plans. Yet, the fact that the city was listening gave us strength. It showed that standing up, speaking out, and fighting for what's right could make a difference. In the days following the meeting, our neighborhood changed in subtle but meaningful ways. More residents became engaged, attending meetings, asking questions, and staying informed. The sense of community grew stronger, built on shared experience and mutual support. People started looking out for each other in new ways, knowing that together we could protect our homes and our rights. I continued to care for the tunnel, ensuring it remained secure and stable. The water inside was still there, a quiet reminder how our resistance had stalled the HOA's plans. It had become a symbol, not just of a personal battle, but of a community's refusal to be ignored or bulldozed. Late one evening, as I stood near the tunnel entrance, I thought about how this fight had changed me. It had tested my patience, courage, and resolve. It had challenged my faith in local leadership and forced me to become an advocate, a leader in a way I never expected. But above all, it had shown me the power of standing firm when everything feels against you. I realized that the flooded tunnel wasn't just a barrier. It was a beacon, a sign that sometimes the strongest defense is a refusal to surrender. It reminded me that change doesn't come easily, but it is possible when people come together and refuse to be silenced. The HOA's attempts to build a road through my private tunnel had sparked more than conflict. It had ignited a movement, united a community, and brought long overdue attention to the importance of respecting property and individual rights. As I looked out over the neighborhood, I knew the story wasn't finished. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but I also knew we were ready. Ready because we had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it feels like an uphill climb, is worth every moment. And sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can change everything.